Welcome back. Please silence your cell phones again. We are now 3 months since the last meeting, and the pandemic has rapidly worsened globally and in the United States. The number of cases and deaths are increasing exponentially. The President did deploy a brigade of 4,500 U.S. military personnel to Jordan. Because of the widespread epidemic and illness among both friendly and enemy combatants, neither side has been able to gain much ground. There's a large outbreak among the U.S. deployment, and many troops have died in Jordan due to the lack of quality medical care. The President directed HHS to provide major medical centers extra training and financial support to take Clade X patients. Fewer hospitals are now refusing to take Clade X patients, but it does remain an ongoing issue. The President met with the National Governors Association, and the Arizona governor relented, restoring commercial air service to the state. But regardless, commercial air travel is still down 43% nationwide. The exercise will now recommence.
Thank you all for coming in again. This has been a really terrible few months for the country, an ongoing crisis. The President has now asked us to think about how we will use the Clade X vaccine when it comes online. We don't yet know when we will have a vaccine, but there's lots of work ongoing in multiple companies, governments, small and large. We need to think about what we're going to do with the vaccine when it becomes available. So we're going to get to that discussion in a moment. But before we do, we want to start with a short GNN clip which updates you a bit on what we know about ABD and the source of the virus.
This news just in. At least some of the individuals responsible for the Clade X virus are now under arrest. They are members of A Brighter Dawn, or ABD, the group that had claimed responsibility. However, authorities believe that key members of ABD's leadership may still be at large. In addition, Interpol has announced that after a long and exhaustive investigation, the laboratory in Switzerland where the virus was created has been raided and shut down. It was masquerading as a small biotech firm in an industrial park outside Zurich. The group was traced to the location through interviews with scientists who work in related fields. Some of them told law enforcement that they had long suspected that ABD's scientists might be dangerous, but they didn't know what to do about it or where to report their suspicions. Sources say the captured ABD members are telling police there were a total of 6 successful releases of aerosolized Clade X in public places in Bethesda, Frankfurt, Caracas, Hong Kong, Dubai, and Kabul. After extensive interviews with the captured ABD members, however, authorities now believe there were an additional 4 releases of Clade X, which did not result in sustained transmission of the disease, including one near the campus of the CDC in Atlanta. Authorities also say the release of Clade X in Bethesda, Maryland, was a deliberate attempt by ABD to cripple the NIH and thwart attempts to quickly find and develop an effective vaccine or treatment for the deadly virus. Meanwhile, the situation is increasingly bleak. GNN medical reporter Emily Schmidt is in Atlanta, outside the CDC's headquarters. Emily, what can you tell us?
Gene, the outbreak is accelerating. More than 40 countries are reporting outbreaks, and many more are suspected of having cases. Global figures of cases are unreliable, but probably number in excess of 8 million. That's according to the World Health Organization. Deaths attributed to the disease are in the millions as well. WHO and national public health authorities are struggling to find more effective ways to contain the virus. WHO states their own modeling projects more than 20 million cases within 6 to 12 months, with more than 7 million deaths. The under-resourced countries are hit the hardest, but wealthier countries cannot stop the epidemic either. Affected cities around the world are seeing their healthcare systems collapse as they cannot provide care for the infected or for routine patients.
Here is the current U.S. situation. The majority of Clade X cases have been reported in and around the nation's capital and in western Massachusetts, but we now have reported cases across approximately half of the U.S. states and in Puerto Rico, including sizable outbreaks in 38 metropolitan areas. We have gone from approximately 60 cases 3 months ago at the last meeting to nearly 60,000 cases now, including more than 3,500 deaths. The Metro DC area alone has 25,000 cases, including 2 members of Congress, several White House officials, and 1 Supreme Court justice. Global markets have plummeted. The Dow Jones is down 60% from its high 5 months ago, and the Fed is now projecting a deep economic recession. Many domestic hospitals are failing due to lack of staff and supplies. Telework and social distancing measures are being encouraged by the CDC. Schools across the country are closed, and many public gatherings have been canceled. Public demand for surgical masks and respirators far exceed the available supply. National Guard units in multiple states have been deployed to provide security for pharmacies and hospitals. Some states are now considering the feasibility of canceling in-person voting in the upcoming 2018 election. Here is the global situation as best we can determine it. Case reporting from many locations is quite unreliable as governments and public health systems have failed. As you can see, Clade X is basically everywhere. As individual country reports are largely unreliable, we are showing case counts by WHO region. We have now more than 8 million probable and confirmed cases and 3 million deaths reported worldwide. The high number of cases in some areas are due to transmission within mega cities and the collapse of some medical systems overseas. In many places, the majority of patients with severe illness are being turned away from healthcare facilities because they cannot provide care to them. These patients are largely dying at home. Some countries have deployed their military to keep order and close their borders. Immigrant and minority groups in some countries are being blamed for spreading the disease. Widespread looting and violent crackdowns have occurred in a number of countries. Several national governments have fallen due to public perception of ineffective response to the pandemic. Updated modeling indicates that a catastrophic outcome is increasingly likely unless a vaccine is deployed soon. We've asked Dr. Tara Kirk-Sill from CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response to tell us about the prospective Clade X vaccines.
There are a number of candidate vaccines that have shown promise in animals, but development is still underway and will take many months. One candidate vaccine made by Azalea Pharmaceuticals appears to be effective against the disease in early clinical trials. The company is working closely with other vaccine manufacturers, HHS, and FDA to rapidly test and manufacture the vaccine. Through the use of new biotechnology approaches and extraordinary effort and cooperation, the initial batches of Azalea candidate vaccine are being produced more rapidly than any previous vaccine for a novel disease. We hope that by enlisting the help of other manufacturers, there could be enough vaccine for 80% of the US population in 6 to 9 months. Furthermore, in an unprecedented move, Azalea has committed to license the vaccine for production in other countries once it is proven. If the vaccine is approved for use, ramping up production will be a gradual process, with initial production capacity expected to be 5 million doses per month. Immunity is expected to take about a month to develop, and more than 1 dose may be required. Ultimately, the impact of the vaccine will be primarily determined by when it becomes available. In this slide, you can see the dramatic difference in mortality based on the time it takes to develop, produce, and dispense the vaccine. Regardless of when the vaccine is ready, delivery will ramp up gradually over several months. Therefore, we need to decide how best to allocate the limited amounts of vaccine as it rolls out. We're proposing 3 options for vaccine distribution, and the table here shows the approximate number of individuals for options 1 and 2. Option 1 prioritizes those with key societal functions in this national crisis, such as government leaders, military, CDC, NIH, healthcare workers, and those making vaccine. Prioritizing healthcare workers and scientists working on the vaccine may increase the overall number of people who can be vaccinated earlier. Prioritizing government officials would ensure continuity of government. Prioritizing critical infrastructure would help ensure the continuing function of essential services. Prioritizing critical infrastructure, however, is not straightforward. There are 16 sectors identified by DHS with tens of millions of people involved. We would have to prioritize within critical infrastructure sectors, which is very difficult. They are all critical. Option 2 prioritizes those most likely to benefit, including the elderly, young children, those with underlying health issues, and pregnant women. Prioritizing these groups who are most likely to be severely affected by the virus aims to save more lives. Option 3 is a lottery in which everyone has an equal chance of being selected to receive the vaccine as it becomes available.
Thank you, Dr. Sell. So, some very, very difficult decisions regarding the use of vaccine. Senator Daschle.
Before we get into the tactical questions and some of these very, very specific issues regarding distribution in particular, I think we have to go back to the strategic question. We're 5 months into this crisis, and I still can't tell you who's in charge. I think it's really troubling that we don't have a clear line of authority, a clear chain of command as we deal with this enormous problem. It's growing, it's ad hoc. We're responding without any real appreciation of what the organizational approach looks like. I think we've got to be focused on that strategic question. Who's in charge? What does the organization look like before we get into the tactics that we're going to be talking about next?
I think the president would say that the president's in charge.
Is he in charge every day? Is he the one on the day-to-day managerial question? I doubt it. I mean, he's got all these other issues he's going to have to deal with. And if that's the answer, I think we're in trouble. Not because of any particular presidential ability, but just because of the nature of his role as president. Somebody has to be in charge and take day-to-day responsibility, and I don't think it can be the president. Okay. We have talked in the past about the importance of somebody of his stature, or his or her stature, and it seems to me the vice president would be that person. But regardless, somebody has to take that responsibility on a day-to-day basis with stature, with the authority, with the organizational appreciation of what is necessary to respond to this massive problem we have today.
I don't want to take us too far off course on this because we've got some issues here, but just as a veteran of the period right before 9/11 and right after 9/11, I think that the majority leader's onto something. And Tom, you've been doing a fantastic job of the last number of months in this, but I know you've got a lot of other things in the world. You are not the lead health official for the country. And you've got political issues, you've got terrorism, you've got a lot. I can see how tired you are after all of this.
Thank you.
You know, after 9/11, we set up a new structure. We set up a Homeland Security Advisor, and we've had a series of really very good ones. You know, I know my boss, Condoleezza Rice, said, you know, I cannot do both. I can't be both National Security Advisor and focus on this issue. And that person has to do earthquakes and terrorism as well. I think the majority leader may be onto something, and it may be something we need to talk to the president about. Frankly, I'm concerned about where we are in the country, where the Homeland Security Advisor is going to be de-elevated and put back down below the National Security Advisor. One thing we've learned is you need to have one person who wakes up every day, beginning tonight, and thinks about this issue. So I do think that that's something that we need to think about.
And do you all think that it could be the Secretary of Health that should be designated as the day-to-day manager of this crisis?
There's a difference between the strategic leadership that requires jointness of government and the operational leadership that gets things done. I think we have a command structure and a joint operations center concept that's been embedded in the Homeland Security environment. We need to respect those interagency processes that are built on a long tradition of how to manage emergency responses. But the strategic interagency capability maybe can be chaired by the secretary, but we need to have jointness at that level.
I think it's really hard to have one of the agencies among several that has responsibility also leading it. It's never actually worked. One of the reasons that I think Ron Klain did a very good job in the Ebola coordination was that he had the ear of the president. He didn't take over any operational responsibilities. He was respectful of people's lanes. But he made sure that if there was an important Defense Department role in aid of the CDC or whatever it might have been, that happened. In my book, when you have an urgency like this, that structure does work. And I think it's very difficult to do it otherwise. We've tried in lots of places in the government to do it that way, creating a first among equals, and it just doesn't work.
Problem is, this is more
for that. I think we've seen it on many different occasions that you really need to elevate it. You really need to have someone who can force the departments and agencies to come together in important ways. And an agency or department head, I couldn't, as Secretary of HHS, tell the Secretary of Defense that he's going to have to pony up this set of resources.
So would everyone around the table be in favor of creating a Ron Klain-like position for this crisis? Is there anyone? No.
I would be in favor of the vice president owning the crisis, but I think if we have to elect a new czar with every crisis, we're in trouble. And I think
this is a pretty serious crisis, though.
Well, that's why I put the vice president in charge.
I don't think the vice president has you have to be able to devote full time to a problem. If you're interested in having a standing function, you can have that standing function within the National Security Council, and then he or she whips into action when there's an event like this. But I think, who's going to go to funerals and things like that the vice president is
I don't think there's anything more important than this right now. This is national security at its ultimate. And it just seems to me it has to be somebody of stature. It has to be somebody who has convening authority. It has to be somebody who has to dress down a cabinet secretary for not doing the right job, for not fulfilling their expectations. I think it really requires somebody of real authority, and that can't be somebody appointed ad hoc. It can't be somebody within the cabinet. It's got to be somebody who has the president's ear and has the constitutional authority to carry out the multiplicity of responsibilities we're talking about here.
Congresswoman Brooks, do you have a comment?
Well, I continue to think about the riots that are happening around the country right now, and we don't have, besides the president making comments at various times. I think the leader is right that we have to have someone else that is working on this day in and day out. It could be the vice president, but I think there needs to be someone also with the medical expertise at the right hand of the president advising all the time, because that's where the challenges lie, and that's what I think everyone is incredibly concerned about. I have advocacy groups, organizations that are lining up outside of all of our offices in Congress, and I'm sure over in the Senate, and they are coming in one after the other, sharing with us that they know that we don't have a vaccine yet. They want vaccines to be prioritized. They believe that as a caring nation, we should be focused on children, the next generation. We should be focused on pregnant women. We should be focused on those who are lacking access to care in many ways. But they do not understand, because we've not done a sufficient job educating them as to what the plan is, what we're all doing day in and day out, or what you all are all doing. We're just taking the calls and meeting with people and, afraid to go home, quite frankly, that there will be riots around all of our homes as to that we're not doing enough. And with this many people dying, I think, and we've got members of Congress who now have it, Supreme Court Justice. I mean, we have not given it, I think, all of the attention that it deserves. I do have to leave. I've been called back to the floor. We are going to be taking an incredibly important vote on PAPA reauthorization and on we know that we have not gotten it right, and while we have one company that is appears, and we all hope and pray that they have the answer, we need to incentivize and make sure that as many companies, jump into this space, because we cannot put all of our hope in this one company that is in early, is showing some early promise. But I think we also have to look at, we are the #1 manufacturing country in the world, and we have to figure out how we can get all of our manufacturers in the life sciences engaged in this, because once we even get the vaccine, that doesn't mean we have enough of syringes to administer the vaccine. It doesn't mean we have enough, we know we don't have enough protective gear to continue to serve our healthcare workers. And so the whole supply chain is broken right now. We know we've got shortages, and while this is so complex, it's my sincere hope, with all of the input that I've gotten and my colleagues in the Senate who started over in PAPA, but we're going to get it right, and I have to go take a vote on it right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? I think Congresswoman Brooks began to express her view somewhere around option 2, at least making sure that children and pregnant women and vulnerable people in the population were protected in some kind of priority. Are there differing views, or do people support that view?
Well, I'm no public health expert, but I have flown on a lot of airplanes. And when the source of air and oxygen comes out from the ceiling of an aircraft in distress, the instruction is that the adults who must take care of the children put the mask on themselves first. And so whether that option 1 is the exact right list, I would say the people who have to be available and healthy to save the rest of the country have to be option 1, however sympathetic options 2 and 3 might be.
Are you worried about the continuity of government?
I am worried about the continuity of government, particularly when you look at the very intentional attack on the United States, and having seen the aftermath and seen and studied the aftermath of 9/11, where there were deep worries about our ability to function post that attack. I am.
I agree with Jamie. We need to worry about continuity of government and protecting critical infrastructure. We also have to recognize that the healthcare workers are the front line here, and that there's increasing concern in our hospitals and healthcare system about their safety, and I have been getting strong requests from facilities across the country that vaccine has to be prioritized to ensure that the workforce can continue to treat patients. I'm not sure that we can't do option 1, although I think we need to rejigger it a bit. I don't know how you define business leaders to help prevent economic collapse. That seems a little bit more...
It's too vague.
Yes, but I think, really working to define critical infrastructure protection, government continuity and healthcare workers and scientists is key. But I think we also do need to think about the use of vaccine for targeted outbreak control potentially, although I guess it takes a month for it to be effective. So, but I also do want to understand when we're going to start this process, because you said when the vaccine is available. Does available mean when it's actually approved and has gone through all its clinical testing, or are we going to we presumably are starting to use the vaccine now, and as we're doing the clinical testing, we can be doing that in a more strategic way as well.
Yeah, studies are underway in animals, but that's as far as we've gotten. We've begun to do clinical testing.
I thought that there was some indication that it had entered human trials. Maybe not.
I think we are at animal trials in the transition to the beginning of human trials.
So the Department of Defense is not listed here in terms of force protection. In
I think we have military is the fourth thing down.
Okay, I guess I was looking over here. Sorry.
You're right. It isn't listed on that, but in the terms of option one, at least they were included there.
Continuity of government here cannot be overestimated. We already have congressionals who are ill in the Supreme Court. If we lose our government, we've lost all the decision making and the confidence impact that would have on Americans. Not to mention our own operations here. We have to maintain essential services.
Smith.
It is not my responsibility of the director of CIA to comment on domestic politics. But however, now that Congresswoman Brooks has left, I'm going to revert to my previous time in the Senate. Before I left a great job to take a terrible job. But the idea that we would focus just on government strikes me as not saleable in the broader public. And some combination of protecting the key healthcare workers, the key people who can keep the government running, and as many others as we can possibly put in option one has to be the case. Because if we have riots in the streets now, one can only imagine what they're going to be if the president stands up and says, well, I'm going to take care of government leaders and business leaders. That's not going to work.
But would people understand, though, taking care of healthcare workers as a high priority?
In my judgment, yes.
Yeah.
But beyond that, and maybe key military or something, beyond that, it gets problematic.
Secretary.
I agree completely. I think that will certainly spur more riots in the street. I want to know what we're doing to make as much vaccine as humanly possible around the globe. What's happening on that score?
Well,
we should certainly be working with other partners around the world in that regard.
So we have not heard of any successes in other countries, but we know other countries are spending enormous amounts of money and talent in pursuit of
Are they
this
ready
vaccine.
to make our vaccine if we prove it successful?
Yes. And Azalea said it'll make it available. The government, we would ensure that Azalea would make it available.
Are they ready for a very rapid transition to manufacturing?
I don't know that.
Yeah, there's a lot of maybe misunderstanding about what it takes to manufacture a vaccine, and so until the process is optimized and you know what you're doing, it's very difficult to be fully prepared to hit the ground running in production. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also mythology around the feasibility of retrofitting existing vaccine manufacturing facilities for whatever new vaccine comes along. One of the reasons a company might decide to weigh in and say, well, we'll take Ebola, is because they already have that platform operational, whereas another well-intentioned company who's not using that particular platform would have to start from scratch, and it would take them 3 years to be able to do that. So we have to be realistic about what the capability of the existing manufacturers is and how fast they can convert. I also note that this is September, we're coming into flu season. Presumably we have to make some decisions about how to prioritize conventional influenza vaccine, and what is that going to do to obfuscating who's got Clade X and who's got flu, and our overall capacity limitations are just likely to get even worse.
Has any analysis been done on our capacity to produce vaccine? I mean, that seems to me a fundamental question. It's not only can you produce it, but what is the volume of production once you've developed it? Do we have any sense as to what that capacity looks like right now?
Well, I think it depends on the vaccine, but we have
Absolutely, yeah.
world expert
Depends on
here.
the vaccine. You know, cell-based vaccines is a viral vaccine, and if the new platform that Azalea is a recombinant platform or, you know, an RNA platform, we could very easily make capacity go fast. But if it's a conventional cell tissue culture-based viral vaccine, that's a lot harder and a lot slower to do, even at, you know, if you clone the production capability. So it really does depend on what platform they're using. And that's part of the point the Secretary was making earlier about really getting to ground zero in terms of looking at platforms that are more, not only more adaptable to new pathogens, but also can be scaled much more efficiently and quickly. I mean, BARDA's been working on that. It's just, it's proving to be somewhat challenging. No one really has a platform yet that we can say is reliable.
So not listed here in option 4 would be to strategically share it with allies or internationally. I doubt there will be domestic political support for that, but I want to hear Secretary Bellinger, Secretary Talent.
So let me address that in 2 parts. I mean, one, certainly, you know, we've learned from the beginning on all of this that this is a matter of international cooperation. You know, this illness goes all around the world. We are in it together. I defer to our experts as to whether there is the capability, if this vaccine is licensed, to produce it more quickly in other countries. I would certainly push other countries to do that and to share it with them so that they can produce it, not only to protect themselves, but to share it back with us. So point one, if that is possible, I would certainly want to do that. That seems like the easier question. The harder one is, do we share with those parts of the world that are not capable of producing a vaccine and have no domestic ability? I've asked my staff, and unfortunately it is the majority of the world. It is much of Central South America and the Caribbean, much of Africa. These are countries that without the vaccine have really no ability to protect themselves. Ideally, you know, we are Americans, and we would like to be able to help the rest of the world. The difficult thing is, for every ounce of vaccine that we share, is that going to come at a cost to Americans? So I would like some number crunching here from the experts. From what I understood,
why don't you assume that it is?
Well, hold on a minute. From what I understand, we would, within a year, have vaccine to protect 80% of the population of the United States. If 100% of the population of the United States is at risk, then I'd have a harder time sharing. But if you epidemiologists tell me that statistically really only 60% of the population is realistically at risk, it gives me a bit more that I would be, you know, potentially willing to share with others. So it may be that we would have to keep all of this ourselves if for every ounce that we share, we are potentially condemning Americans to death. But if there are some people, Americans, who are at very, very, very low risk, and we can save lives around the world, I would not want to rule that out.
Reactions?
Well, what do we know about who's at risk at this point?
At this point, we don't see any clear risk profile in terms of susceptibility versus immunity. I think it's presumed generalized risk. People who are immunosuppressed seem to be at somewhat higher risk, but in general, the general susceptibility of the population is high.
I mean, we had a number of states from your chart that seemed to have very few cases in them. I mean, my sense, I'm no expert in this, but is that there's some significant part of the United States that at least hasn't been at risk over the last 6 months. And so if we could, if we could already cover 80% of the United States, there may be an ability for us to share with others. I really don't like to see us just cutting ourselves off and consigning much of the rest of the world to death.
Secretary Talent?
Are we still living under the brief the last time that potentially this is 500,000 to 2 million deaths in the United States, or is it potentially
we already
greater
have
than that?
more.
We already have 3 million
Well,
plus.
in deaths in the United States?
Oh, not in the U.S., sorry.
Oh.
Because it's,
Oh, I see. You're asking about
Right.
the U.S. only.
it strikes me that it's probably higher than that now here. And if those estimates are still good, I don't think it is sustainable to share large amounts of this vaccine around the world until Americans have gotten vaccinated. I think it's a non-starter. I'm not saying the impulses that are moving the secretary are wrong. And we might be able to, if we maybe reserve small amounts of it for instances which are where we can vaccinate people where it's particularly important, give the president some discretion to the national security of the United States or something like that. But I think it's a non-starter. I'm going to speak up for my servicemen and women, and in the discussions we've had over the last several meetings, we've seen how central the role of the armed forces, including their reserve components, are to so many other things that we're trying to do to battle this epidemic. And so I could probably, if that was the weight of the opinion here, slim that down a little bit from 3 million, which covers about everybody, including the reserve components, and take out some specialties, et cetera. But I would argue, and I'll volunteer not to take it, but the war fighters and the combat support people, as well as the Guard and reserve components, I think we need to vaccinate as soon as possible.
Is this product the only product that is looking promising and moving along in development?
It stands out. It's far ahead of other products.
And around the world as well?
Yes.
Because I think, if we really are addressing this in a sort of a global way, and the company is serious about wanting to make it available, then I think we need to bring other countries that have manufacturing capability into discussions now, because, if we want to actually be able to quickly gear up, we don't want to wait until the vaccine is actually, finalized and approved here for them to start thinking about what it would take to manufacture in another country. Plus, you want to get the regulators in those countries involved, because just because the company wants to make it available in other countries, there was a phrase about that they will license the vaccine to other countries, but there are regulatory authorities that need to be part of that process, so they should get involved early as well.
Director Gerberding, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
I'm always sobered when I think of vaccine manufacturing capacity on a global basis. And I agree that China has a lot of vaccine production capability of a certain type, and that India has a lot of vaccine production capability of a certain type. But when you really look at who can go to broader scale for global utilization, we're talking 4 companies. So, it is a very precious resource, and it isn't so much building the plant and putting in the vats. It has to do with the technical know-how to be able to take something that's not sterile and end up with something that's safe enough to put in babies and very vulnerable people. So our nation as a country and our globe as an entity really is suffering under an environment of diminishing vaccine production capability at scale. So it's just an important, another capacity issue that doesn't get enough attention.
To be able to ensure quality, and there's also going to be a black market. There's going to be a lot of fraudulent product that's going to start to become.
Can I come back to something actually that I don't want to miss that Secretary Talent at least conceded here, which is that there may be parts of the world that, or groups in parts of the world that we would want to protect under essentially the same matrix that we've got here. It may be that there's not enough to share for all populations that don't have the vaccine, but we hope we are going to get through this in some period, and after that, we're going to want the rest of the world to be there and not in a state of collapse. So again, this is cost benefit. I'm going to need the statistics from you all as to, for every ounce that we share, are we losing American lives? But if we can preserve governments and continuity of government and healthcare workers in key countries around the world, this is your point, it's in our national security interest to prop those up so that we are not then facing a worldwide collapse. So I think we are going to need to slice this pretty carefully to see what's the cost and then what's the particular benefit to sharing with a particular country and a particular government. If that, these are tough choices, but there may be some parts of the world where if we don't prop them up now, we're going to be facing a lot more problems later on.
I do want to clarify, I was not talking about a large volume of the vaccine, but I think we could probably get away with small amounts where there's special circumstances. I just think we have to, but I'm for option 1, basically. I do think we want to vet that list and prioritize. And then option 2 would be, as more vaccine comes online, it's administered to those who most likely to benefit up front. So in a sense, we're doing both, and I think this can be communicated effectively to the American people that way. Look, we have to take care of the people who empower us to take care of everybody else.
But
How
the
are we
same
define that?
principle, I mean, look, I admire Secretary Bellinger's impulse. I think the fine decisions that would need to be made are very, very difficult trade-offs. And the same principle that underlies option 1, I think should underlie our decision to take care of and re-strengthen the United States. We have been unbelievably weakened by this crisis. Our economy has been shot. Our people are hurting. There are major riots and demonstrations. We are the leader here. I mean, you just look at the conversation we've just had about the production of a vaccine. There's no there anyplace else. In order to save the world, we need to save ourselves and then save the rest of the world. While it is, I could imagine that there are circumstances where we would say we need to help X, Y, and Z in order to help ourselves. I think my bias and our bias should be to the option 1 as it would be applied to the United States first. I don't mean to sound jingoistic, I mean to sound very practical.
Director Smith.
I wish to associate myself a bit with the Secretary of State. We clearly have a responsibility to protect American citizens, and we need to do all we can. But we should not, as rapidly as we can, but at the same time, we should keep in mind that this will come to an end.
Yes.
And how we behave as a country will determine how other people judge us in other parts of the world. So somehow or another, we have to keep open the hope that other countries can benefit from what we do, whether it's licensing this, whether it's transferring the technology, whether it's rapidly building plants elsewhere in the world. We have an obligation to lead, and I think in this room, I agree with the Attorney General, but I think at the same time, the President ought to be trying to look ahead. Just as we began to think about the Marshall Plan early in World War II and the occupation of Japan, we need to be thinking about what happens when this is over. Finally, a point not in my domain, but as we also build up this capacity to produce vaccines, we need to worry about we're a litigious society. We need to worry about the ability of the people who produce this to survive the lawsuits that will be filed when something goes wrong. So somehow or another, we need to either build in statutory immunity or indemnification or something to give companies the confidence that if they put themselves on the line to save American lives, the plaintiff's bar is not going to destroy them.
Yeah, I have a bill to take care of that.
I beg your pardon?
I have a piece of legislation that takes care of that.
Thank you.
So,
do you?
Two final comments, and then we're going to need to wrap up. Secretary O'Toole and then Senator Daschle.
I understand the reasoning behind option 1, but it's very technocratic. I think if you go out and you tell the American public that we are going to give vaccines to people running public utilities over babies, that will not go over well. These are very subjective decisions. I understand the importance of critical infrastructure, but I think it would behoove us to have some kind of understanding of who is actually most at risk from this disease. From what I heard, it was the adults that were dying, not the children. I don't know if that's still the case. It seems to me odd that we have this very high case fatality rate. Who are those people who are dying and other people have mild illness? We ought to try and find some way to scientifically, cull out those who would most benefit from the vaccine, particularly if it's going to take, more than one dose and more than a month for immunity to develop?
Yeah.
That ought to be a focus of our attention. We ought to be able to figure that out, at least to some empirical degree. But I think leaving children off the list is a big mistake. You'll have every parent in arms.
Senator Daschle.
I think Secretary O'Toole just gave my speech. But I think Director Smith said it well earlier, too. We have to take into account the political reality here. The political reality is that you'll never get the American people to agree that members of Congress and business leaders deserve vaccine over them, especially over their children. So we've got to figure out a way to combine option 1 and option 2 to define more critically who is really essential for medical personnel, for first responders, for the people that really matter in ensuring that we address the challenge, but then also take into account the humanitarian need that I think the American people are going to demand as this crisis unfolds.
Thank you all so much for this very difficult decision and very, very valuable input. At this point, the meeting is adjourned, and we will now hear from Anita.
Thank you. So how does this scenario play out? We're going to jump ahead 10 months to July 2019.
"20 months into one of the worst pandemics the world's ever known, there's still no vaccine to protect people. Hard figures are impossible to come by, but the World Health Organization estimates that 150 million people have died. That's approximately 2% of the global population. For industrial countries, the death rate's a bit lower, but in many low and middle-income countries, the death rate's much higher. As many as 30% of the seriously ill have died. In the U.S., there have been an estimated 82 million severe cases and 15 million deaths. At least 5 million Clade X deaths happened because adequate medical care wasn't available. No doubt, millions of others will have died prematurely from heart attacks, strokes, cancer, and the like. The U.S., along with the rest of the world, is in its worst economic depression in history. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 90%, the GDP down 50%, and unemployment is running at 20%. Unemployment would be higher if not for the dramatic shrinkage of the available workforce due to death and disability. U.S. healthcare and health insurance systems, as we knew them, have collapsed. Health insurance companies ran out of capital and couldn't pay their bills, leaving hospitals without operating funds. In addition, most medical supplies are unavailable. Half the healthcare workforce has died, become disabled, or quit. The remaining healthcare facilities can't cope with all the patients, and consequently, death rates are soaring, both for Clade X patients and for everyone else. It was only by nationalizing the healthcare system that basic medical care is still available. The government now pays for, controls, and rations all medical care. The U.S. is in a constitutional crisis. The president remains in critical condition, and while the vice president is out of intensive care, he remains unable to assume his constitutional duties. Therefore, the Speaker of the House is the acting president. Continuity of government is a major concern. 1/3 of the U.S. Congress is dead or incapacitated, as are 2 members of the Supreme Court and senior members of the administration. Government functioning at the federal, state, and local levels has been brought to a near halt. After the failure of the first vaccine that seemed so promising 15 months ago, along with several other candidates, we now see fresh optimism. The Omega vaccine, which has finally been shown to be safe and effective, is just starting to be deployed as fast as it can be manufactured and distributed. 1/3 of Americans are expected to have access to the vaccine in the next 6 to 8 months. Global vaccine distribution and dispensing, which is an enormous undertaking in the best of circumstances, has been slowed in many locations by riots and looting at vaccination sites. Infectious disease specialists seem to agree that once 80% of the people have been vaccinated, the epidemic should be brought under control with an ultimate 20 million deaths in the U.S. These same infectious disease specialists say we're lucky because the virus is similar in some ways to common para-influenza viruses, and only 1 dose of vaccine is needed. The situation in most of the rest of the world is much worse. Massive loss of life, economic collapse, famine, and civil unrest. There's been a mass exodus from cities, adding to the spread of the disease and making vaccination programs even more difficult. The nagging question: what would have happened if we had a vaccine many months earlier? If the first vaccine had worked and started to be deployed at 6 months into the pandemic, the U.S. death toll could have been reduced from an anticipated 20 million to 6 million, with similar reductions in economic and societal consequences. On the other hand, what if years go by without a vaccine? Then, experts tell us that we could eventually see 30 to 40 million deaths in the U.S. and more than 900 million around the world, 12% of the global population. Eventually, once almost everyone's been exposed, the disease will either burn itself out or become endemic, like the dreaded childhood diseases of prior centuries. What the world will look like when it's done is still very uncertain.
So that's the conclusion of the exercise, and the outcome was obviously catastrophic. One important takeaway is that a pathogen doesn't necessarily have to be extraordinarily lethal or contagious to develop into a severe pandemic. As you recall, Clade X did not spread as fast as the flu, and it had about the same lethality as SARS. And the 1918 pandemic flu, which killed as many as 100 million people, had a fatality rate much lower than MERS, than Nipah, than H5N1, and H7N9. So if a virus of that lethality developed an efficient respiratory transmission, it could produce a pandemic even worse than Clade X. Of course, there were other contributing factors in this exercise, like the lack of a readily available vaccine, and also the fact that there were deliberate, intentional attacks around the world. In today's exercise, we couldn't represent all of the different aspects of science and planning that go into preparedness, like agricultural surveillance, avian influenza planning, and also diagnostics development is very important. They each merit more attention than they're getting, and they could merit their own exercise in and of themselves. We also don't want to leave you with the impression that important public health measures, such as isolation of the sick and disease surveillance, aren't important. They're incredibly important. In Ebola and SARS, these interventions probably made all the difference in being able to control those diseases. But we just can't prepare for the outbreaks that we've seen before. We believe we should have some amount of dedicated and meaningful time and energy put into thinking about severe pandemics that are large scale and could be potentially catastrophic. And thinking about if the United States and other countries have the capabilities to deal with them, or what kind of capabilities we would have. So it was really valuable, I'm sure, for everyone today, watching these very experienced leaders wrestle with these really difficult issues. And you, of course, have the benefit of having, many of you, some experience with this in the past. These are tough issues, so with a fast-moving pandemic, regardless of the best decisions of our leaders, it could still overwhelm our capabilities. So we're really eager to parse through all that we've been hearing today from the various conversations and translate that into recommendations for new U.S. policy. And we're going to do that in the days and weeks ahead. So in a moment, we're going to turn to Jean Meserve, who's going to run the hot wash and talk about our participants' reactions to this scenario. But I wanted to let you know that as you leave today, we'll be handing out a document with our Center for Health Security's 6 recommendations of what we think that the U.S. government should do to be able to prevent or to mitigate a severe pandemic like this from occurring. And I'm just going to go through very quickly through our 6 key points. First, as was clear in the scenario, we really need to be able to make vaccines and medicines far more rapidly. The U.S. has invested considerable resources in medical countermeasure development for a range of biological threats. But in order to really drastically reduce the amount of time it's going to take to produce these countermeasures, we have to have much more investment in that and really a focus on the systems that we would need to make countermeasures available for novel pandemic threats. Second, the U.S. should strengthen its commitment to the global health security agenda and really continue to invest internationally in bolstering other countries' capabilities to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to severe pandemics. We also support the creation of a deployable clinical corps, which would be capable from the U.S. to respond to international infectious disease emergencies. Third, the U.S. needs a strong and dynamic public health system capable of handling large-scale infectious disease outbreaks. The public health workforce is working with diminishing budgets and resource constraints, even in the face of small outbreaks. So we really have to reverse that trend. Fourth, we should have a national plan that effectively harnesses nationwide healthcare assets in a pandemic. The various components of the healthcare system, including the large portion that are private hospitals, need to understand in advance what their roles are going to be in such an event. Fifth, a national and really ultimately international strategy is needed to address developments in bioresearch engineering that increase pandemic risks. The pathogen in our scenario is fictional, but the potential to create a new pandemic risk is real. So we propose some ideas in that regard to advance thinking in this area, and that's in our policy document. Finally, severe pandemics will have major impacts on the national security missions of government. So national security agencies really need to understand for and plan for both the first order and cascading consequences of pandemics. The White House needs to have senior leaders who can drive planning and response efforts. We need a national security strategy that would proactively consider pandemic threats, and we do need the National Biodefense Strategy, which we know is under development. So now, before we conclude, I want to give our participants an opportunity to talk about their reactions. And so we've invited our 24/7 GNN anchor, Jean Meserve, to run the hot wash.
Thanks, Anita. So a discussion of what we've learned and what we can do about it. For you, the biggest takeaways from what we've done here today? Tara, do you want to start? Oh, Senator Daschle, you had your hand up.
Oh, well, I would just say I think there are 5 things that I think have come out of this discussion. We talked a lot throughout the day about the importance of leadership. But I don't think it's only leadership in a crisis. It's leadership between the crises that is maybe even more important. It's a recognition that we haven't done our planning, we haven't done our coordinating, we haven't done the kind of thoughtful analysis about how we manage a crisis before the crisis even starts. That's number 1. Number 2, I've said it so many times, but I think it's really worth repeating. We need that strategic plan for biodefense. It's been sitting there now for a year and a half without action. We haven't had it implemented. It was due last September, but that plan should include stockpiling for multi-year funding to accommodate vaccine response. That has to be part of the plan. Third, that plan also has to have a leader. We have to have somebody who's in charge, and throughout this whole exercise, I don't think we had a leader. And we had a president intermittently coming back, calling us together, but we needed a day-to-day leader. Fourth, we need to conduct annual exercises to deploy the plan and test it. The plan is worthless if it sits on a shelf. We have to make it work at least once a year. That includes governors, it includes all of the officials who might be called upon to deal and manage with the crisis, but you actually implement the plan with some sort of a deployment exercise. And then finally, there has to be an international coordinating infrastructure to address the critical need for effective response outside our borders.
Comprehensive list. Other additions?
I think we need to think about medical countermeasures the way we think about the needs of the Navy or the Air Force or the Army. We're just not taking it seriously enough.
We better take it more seriously than that. We haven't been funding them either.
Well, good point. But it is a national security issue that we are not treating like a national security issue, and it's not going to go away. We're in an age of epidemics for a variety of reasons. We're going to see more and more infectious disease outbreaks, and we've got to develop an effective strategy for dealing with them. I would also like to highlight something that's not on the center's list, which is the critical strategic importance of rapid point-of-care diagnostics. The technology for these is out there. We just haven't bothered to marshal it. If we wanted to, we could figure out how to use CRISPR to make very quick diagnostic tools against virtually any infectious agent. So I think the importance of diagnostics, which is illustrated in Ebola, and again today, has not gotten enough attention. And thirdly, the third thing I'd say is that we have to educate the public on a more regular basis about the nature of infectious disease outbreaks and what they can do to protect themselves and their families, not just in a time of crisis, but every flu season. I know CDC has tried to do this. CDC needs help from other elected officials and other leaders in the community to help people understand that this is not simply an act of God. There's things they can do to protect themselves. And finally, as somebody said, we need to revisit the Public Health Service Corps and make it into a real national asset.
Any comment, Dr. Gerberding, about CDC and this educational effort?
I certainly agree with that notion. I think also we're still trying to, CDC can do a lot, but as the scale and the scope of what this public health agency has to do, we need additional authorities and additional reach. And I thought it was intriguing that your point was a national public health system, because we live and work in a federation, but at some point, in the same way that we understand when we would nationalize our Department of Defense assets, we have to understand when we nationalize our healthcare assets and when we nationalize our public health assets, and that we operate as a unified entity rather than a set of 50 states and several territories. I think the other dimension of that is real strengthening of the deployable response capability. We have technical experts and people who are increasingly trained for deployment, but it's not anywhere near the mass or the breadth that we need to be on top of these efforts. I think that's really an HHS issue, not just a CDC issue, because we could say the same thing about other components of the HHS response. But the Commission Corps and the Public Health Service, the uniform service, really needs to be strengthened and modernized.
Dr. Hamburg, you want to weigh in?
Well, I was going to actually make a comment that is not exactly building on other comments, but I think reflects some of the points made, which is that I think we're operating now in a very different environment than we were even 5-10 years ago. And that has to change how we think about the inter-crisis activities.
What do you mean the environment's changed?
Well, I'm going to come to that. I think that the importance of really educating the public and policymakers about the nature of this kind of threat and what's required for planning and preparedness is more important than ever. We're in an environment now with social media, 24-hour cable news, et cetera, and an environment in which experts and the value of science is increasingly questioned, that we can't just assume that in a crisis we can get up and talk to the American people and get them to believe us and understand and act. And I think that
there won't be disinformation.
And that what was missing from this incredible exercise and all that went in was, I think, the real sense of what was happening on the ground. In the very last episode we talked about the riots, but from the very beginning, the level of unrest and concern and questioning and distrust, I think, would add a whole other complexity to response, and the misinformation would be huge. The necessity to try to get out in front of that, I think would add, a huge set of pressures to the role of leadership, communication, and response. And so I think we have to also think very carefully about that set of issues and how to address them. And just, it's an environment, as you well know, where one thing that goes out into the media can suddenly mushroom, and before you know it, everything you're doing in the most systematic and science-based way can be derailed. So I think it's really a very different environment.
Legal authorities was mentioned. John Bellinger, do you want to weigh in on what might be needed to be done there?
I defer to the Attorney General on legal authority, but a related point on that are the explanation, we talked about this, the explanations that we are going to need to push back on politically sort of popular reactions, travel bans, quarantines, domestic travel bans. You know, all the experts around the table basically agree these are bad ideas, they haven't worked, but we know in advance that we're going to get those arguments, and it is going to fall to the president and a new presidents. These are things you need to train new presidents and new leaders. When those arguments come up, people need to be prepared with the statistics of why it doesn't work, so that we're not on the back foot. I mean, the good news is on something like this, people always want to have travel bans and quarantines, so we can have those talking points. Point one. At the international level, I've been making this point all day long, but this is why one of the reasons we need to have a strong State Department is that we need to have these international contacts around the world, these partnerships. They don't just grow on trees, and if we don't fund them and we let them atrophy when there is a crisis, we don't have the relationships, we don't know who to talk to. We need to have these exercises at an international level. So, this is one of many things the State Department does that we need to emphasize. Last 2 points, again, I think we're in agreement on this point. There needs to be some sort of a czar. I don't know if the czar should always just be doing public health, because there will be hopefully many periods when the person's not needed. But just to repeat again, I'm quite nervous about where we are with this administration, cutting back and actually just folding it all the way back down and maybe even taking it off the NSC staff altogether. So there's really no coordinator in the White House at all, much less a Homeland Security advisor. So who would be in charge in a crisis now? I think that's certainly a lesson learned. And then finally, not my lane at all, but just listening to all of you, really sounds like we need a domestic response capability, whether it's to train up the National Guard more, as we were discussing at lunch, so that in the midst of a crisis, we can really have people who can be deployed around the United States.
John, could I just respond to one thing?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes our mental model is that we need a crisis leader, but part of the problem that we have is that we lead through the crisis, but then when it's over, it goes away. And I just would like to make a case for the fact that whomever is the accountable leader, that person is in it for the long haul, because there's as much to do before the crisis and after the crisis as there is to do during the crisis. And where we fall is when we rev up and then everything disappears, including the leader often, and then the next time something happens, we're back at square one.
Let me just respond, because I think this will probably be some sort of recommendation. I mean, this is the challenge, is that the point was made here, when we have a crisis of the sort we've been talking about here, you need, Tara, you talked about, we should have the vice president, but you need a very high-level person, somebody who can literally knock the heads of cabinet secretaries. The thing is, you can't have at that senior level a person just sitting around waiting. Right. On the other hand, I think, Julie, what you're saying is, well, we should at least always have an expert like one of you all who was on the NSC staff who knows this cold, and so when a crisis does come along, they know what to do. The problem is someone like that is going to be an expert, but at a much lower level. So
it may be out of the crisis, there's going to be a list of things that we need to do. And you want someone who's going to be working on that list. And I think you want someone at a high level to make sure that there really is
look, the Defense Department does this routinely. It has a planning function. It is simply part of its existence as a department. And we don't do that anywhere else. I mean, when I went from defense to justice, I said, where's our planning function? Right. And it just wasn't there. So I think we need to export from DOD that expertise, vest it someplace, and keep it there with responsibility for exercising it and being there when a crisis hits. That's a structural observation I would make. I have a few more if you're.
It's a budgetary issue too. We spend
it's budgetary.
I mean, we spend the equivalent of a half of an aircraft carrier on biodefense every year. 1/2 of an aircraft carrier. That's all we spend on this entire challenge. So we've got to figure out a way to make that budget a real priority. It's not just personnel. You can move the chairs around, but you've got to have budget to make this real, and we don't have it today.
Our Secretary of Defense wanted to weigh in.
I totally agree with what Tom said about the chain of command. They were both saying it through this whole thing. I just don't think you have to have somebody making in charge, and somebody the public knows is in charge, and somebody who's accountable. And as a practical matter, it's probably not going to be the president through large parts of this. As a matter of fact, I think Bob Graham and I said that in our report on this subject years ago. That's one. Two, we've been talking about educating the American people. I'm going to be a little more granular or tangible, concrete than that. We have not in this country, since the end of the Cold War, explained to the American people, we have not updated our strategic foreign policy to explain to the American people what the interests are that are at stake and why, and what the tools we ought to have to defend them. And if you don't, in a democracy, people don't like spending money on this kind of thing, really. And if you don't explain why, they're going to want, now, health is different, but public health, not so much, right? In other words, they're not going to sustain the tools that you need to be effective over time. I have worked on this issue in the context of the armed forces, I mean, intensely for the last 10 years. And the irony of it is, we spend about 3% of the GDP on the Department of Defense. I'm the biggest defense hawk in Washington, and I want to spend 4% of the GDP, another 1%. And these other needs in public health and the rest of it, if you could get another 1% above that, State Department and the rest of it, we could fund robustly all of these needs. That's affordable, particularly when it buys you this kind of insurance. I mean, the American people, Tom and I ran for office, others here, I mean, we could sell this to people if we just explained to them what really was at stake. I will tell you, and many of you served in these administrations and I worked with them, I think this has been a major failure of the four administrations since the end of the Cold War. It's not on that level to explain strategically, and it needs to happen. I think that the only other thing I want to say specifically with regard to this, I came away from this, if I'm ever in, God forbid, in a position to, well, I wouldn't mind being in a position to do something, but I hated it if it happened, to do something about this, is that if I could go back and think, what could we have done with what we had available? What should we have done different? Once it was clear that this was, in context, relatively speaking, pretty highly contagious, okay, so this is not Ebola, which is much more difficult to transmit, we should have erred on the side of acting pretty ruthlessly early on.
And done what?
Well, I don't know, but we should have, I mean, the political top should have said to the medical experts, look, the downside of this is unthinkable, okay? So what you tell us, because maybe it is quarantining, maybe it is stopping, whatever you think we need to do to avoid this downside, you have to consider doing, because this is existential. I mean, America's just wiped out in the last 6 hours, basically. If you're losing 60% of the GDP, I mean, the consequences, not wiped out, but the consequences are just unthinkable, really.
Jeffrey Smith, you wanted to weigh.
I know we're short on time. Part of the problem is this issue has the amazing capacity to be number 11 on anybody's list of 10 most important items. And somehow or another, we've got to break through the cacophony in Washington competing for money. I mean, infrastructure, defense, all these other things are competing for money. Somehow finding a way to make this the issue that it deserves. One thing that strikes me is, I agree with everything Senator Daschle said in terms of leadership and so on, but we also need a way of incentivizing American people and industry to participate in this and to say why it's in their interest and not just frighten them to death. So something very innovative. I'm a fan of In-Q-Tel, something that is a way of incentivizing industry, the markets, Wall Street, to make this worthwhile, to build up America's industrial capacity, just like the Manhattan Project or other things that have been done that advanced more than just healthcare.
In the aftermath of 9/11, we had the 9/11 Commission, and I would say our most salient point was that there was a failure of imagination. We could not imagine an event like this, and therefore we didn't approach the challenge with the kind of urgency that we would to break through some of the barriers. A number of action items that were on the lists of people like us in this room never made it onto the national agenda because the urgency of it was not explained. The need to spend the money, the need to break through the federalism problems that we've seen here today. And so I think one solution is something like this, but it really does call upon our national leaders to lead by explaining the threat and explaining the possible solutions. There are very concrete solutions to what we have seen here today, things that would have prevented the collapse of the economy, the deaths of tens of millions of people, untold other harm. And yet it is a failure of our own imagination to see that is the obstacle to change.
So very quickly from each of you, one thing government should do, our government, other governments, to make this work better. Who wants this? Should we start right here?
Just develop the plan and implement it.
Get beyond incentivizing companies to make MCMs to paying for the cost of developing MCMs. Let the private companies do it, but understand that this is a national security imperative.
Make a plan to have the federal and state resources work cohesively as opposed to at odds with each other.
Keep up our international partnerships. Plan not only tabletop exercises domestically, but internationally.
Tom, do you
I would say make sure we have leaders of this caliber around the table in crisis, because it's stunning.
With this depth of knowledge on the subject.
I agree with Tara. Stockpile and develop the capability to go from bug to drug as quickly as possible.
I'm afraid I have to echo that. I think it's to me, it's not so much stockpiling as, really employing the opportunities in science and technology today to have, much more sophisticated development strategies, new platforms for vaccines, new point of care diagnostics, new ways of really understanding quickly what we're dealing with and being able to address it, because I think everything everybody else has said is really important, but if we don't have anything to offer medically, it's very hard to really galvanize the response.
Institutionalize this as a high priority, but without creating the bureaucratic baggage that goes with having it become ossified over time. And nobody should end this without saying what a phenomenal job Tom and his center has done for many, many years, including Tara when she was in it, to make this a priority. And we need to do more of this, and they need the support and the applause of Americans.
Okay, of this, you mean exercises?
Tom's center. Tom's center.
I certainly can't argue with the Manhattan Project for medical countermeasures, but I would also want to make sure we don't lose sight of the importance of threat detection, threat assessment, threat detection, and we haven't talked about labs, surveillance, and the importance of global networks of surveillance. We have critical assets, the NAMRU, the military labs are absolutely hidden, but extremely important to this effort. So are the broad investments that CDC and WHO and others are making, but they are so limited in reach and capability and sustainability, and that's got to be the backbone. If we don't have detection, it doesn't matter if we have countermeasures or not.
Synthesizing all this, it all comes down to these C's, I think: communication, chain of command, coordination, cooperation, capacity, and cash.
You wrote that ahead of time.
And commitment.
Commitment. Oh, yeah, good C. Like that. Thank you all. Anita.
Thank you, Jean.
That was impressive, Jean. I like the C's. So thank you to the audience and also for those listening on the live stream. I want to thank the Open Philanthropy Project for making this exercise possible. Also, a big thanks to Jean and the center staff and really our larger Clade X team for putting this event together. And I especially want to thank our participants for their hard work today. And please join me again in a round of applause. There's refreshments next door, and we hope you will come and talk to us, and we stand adjourned. Thank you very much.